Today, most houses are filled with televisions and devices that have access to all sorts of platforms that produce and stream a mind-numbing amount of content, including the content you're watching today on YouTube. And most of that content today is produced digitally, and it comes into our house through cables or through the internet. But for a long time, most television was broadcast via an antenna, picked up via the airwaves. And inventors like Philo T. Farnsworth and Vladimir Zworykin had developed the technology to be able to do that in the 1920s, but television didn't become popular and wasn't common in households until after the Second World War. But that doesn't mean that nothing happened in between. The big networks that we recognize today, ABC, NBC, and CBS, all formed as radio networks during that period. But one of the lesser-known stories of early broadcast television started in 1926 when a Cadillac dealer bought his first radio station. He had a license to broadcast television in 1931, nearly a decade ahead of the big three. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Don Lee was born in Michigan and made his money by acquiring the exclusive distribution rights for Cadillac cars in California. He used his large personal fortune to purchase the radio station KFRC in San Francisco in 1926, and a year later KHJ in Los Angeles. Lee expanded his radio network across the coast, acquiring stations in Oregon and Washington. A few years later, the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, extended facilities to the coast, and it extended an invitation to Lee's network to broadcast Columbia programming. By 1931, Lee had turned KHJ into the broadcasting hub for his first television station, which broadcast under the call sign W6XS and a sister station W6XAO. He wasn't the very first to start producing television content in America, but the big three didn't start broadcasting television until the eve of the Second World War. He appointed a young engineer named Harry Lubke to run his experimental station, and Lubke became the director of television for the Don Lee Broadcasting System. One of the problems with the television broadcasting network in 1931 was that no one owned a television. It was something of a catch-22. No one would buy a television unless there was something to watch on them, but it was difficult for anyone to produce content when there wasn't anyone to watch. To mitigate this issue, Lubke distributed plans to amateur tinkerers in LA for construction of mechanical receiving sets. In 1939, it was estimated that something like 100 people built televisions using Lubke's plans. The station became one of the first to offer regularly scheduled programming on the West Coast when they started broadcasting 1 hour every day except Sundays. The content was mostly, quote, filmed action and close-ups of movie stars, and was broadcast between 6 and 7 in the evening. And they were one of very few stations to continue broadcasting throughout the war. It's largely due to Harry Lubke that the early network was able to transcend from just being an early television network to one that made a mark in television history. Though he would die almost completely unknown, Lubke was a talented engineer and pioneered many television innovations. Like many inventors of the time, Lubke did his own tinkering with the television set. In 1929, he was working with Farnsworth in San Francisco to produce an all-electronic scanning generator system, which was probably one of the more important items in the unprecedented settlement between Farnsworth and RCA in September 1939. RCA purchased a number of Lubke's patents regarding synchronization in 1938. Lubke continued to do work on synchronization, electronic television, and the self-synchronized cathode ray tube. Though many of these patents have become forgotten, the value of his self-synchronizing cathode ray tube was likely the most important. In 1932, Lubke demonstrated television reception on an airplane, largely thanks to his advances in synchronization. According to the Spokane Daily Chronicle on May 23, 1932, Lubke planned to transmit a picture to an airplane cruising about 5 miles away at an altitude of approximately 6,000 feet. The test successfully transmitted a picture of a girl onto the plane from W6XAO. His work led Don Lee to make Lubke the face of West Coast television and of W6XAO. W6XAO was one of just 6 experimental TV stations that existed by 1939. In 1933, it broadcast possibly the earliest television news coverage when they telecast news footage of a Long Beach earthquake to LA only a few hours after the event. The station managed to add another first on the very same day when it became the first to broadcast a motion picture, The Crooked Circle, which it broadcast on March 10, 1933. It's believed that the movie was seen by perhaps 5 LA area television receivers. The LA Times Sunday Magazine said in 1936 that W6XAO was the only station that releases regular television broadcasts and one of 4 centers in the U.S. where serious scientific work on television was being done. But there were big changes on the horizon. In 1934, Don Lee passed away from a heart attack and left his Cadillac business and his broadcasting system to his son, Thomas Lee. The quality of the product that they were producing was increasing over the period. For analog television, the quality of the resolution, how good your picture is, depends upon the number of lines that are broadcast. And in 1936, they moved from broadcasting in 80 lines to 300 lines, or a great improvement in the picture resolution. And that was up again to 441 lines in 1938, and 30 frames per second, which was on par with the RCA system. By the outset of the war, they were broadcasting 525 lines. Around 1940, Lee moved the station from 7th and Bixel in LA to a new location behind the famous Hollywood sign on top of the hill that is now called Mount Lee. Lubke called it the first structure in the world erected exclusively for telecasting. In 1938, W6XAO broadcast the first American television soap opera when it began airing Vine Street, a 15-minute serial aired twice a week about the difficulties of making it big in Tinseltown. By the next year, 4 of 6 nights a week were aired with live talent produced in-house. On January 1st, 1940, the station became the first on the West Coast to transmit a remote broadcast when they broadcast the Tournament of Roses parade. In 1940, Lubke said that the Lee station was focusing on developing variety shows, and that the longest play they had run so far was a 40-minute presentation of Hamlet. By 1940, several different kinds of television were on sale commercially from companies like GE and RCA, and there were hundreds of sets in LA to watch the 10.5 hours a week the station broadcast. Most of the time was occupied by films, but they also covered newsreels and their own programming. The broadcast could be picked up at least 22 miles away in Long Beach, where one watcher said he had as many as 30 visitors in one evening to watch. In 1941, W6XAO operated 590 hours and broadcast 67 remote programs. But despite all their innovative television firsts, it wouldn't be a surprise if you've never heard of the Don Lee Broadcasting Network, because while they were busy being pioneers of early television, they were also setting the stage for their own decline. The network wanted to remain an independent network at the time when the larger networks were growing. The network was mostly made up of radio stations across California and in Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. The network's relationship with Columbia fell apart shortly after Don Lee's death in 1934. Friction had been growing between the networks as CBS began demanding more control over its affiliates, especially over programming. In 1936, CBS bought KNX in LA and another in San Francisco to replace the need for the Lee network. Fortunately for Tommy Lee, at the same time that CBS was ridding itself of the Lee network, the Mutual Broadcasting System was looking to expand to the West Coast. The switch was scheduled for December 29, 1936, the same day that the CBS contract ended. Even under the new contract, the Lee network maintained a peculiar independence. Technically speaking, Mutual had only a single affiliate west of the Rockies, the Don Lee network itself. Mutual had no relationship with the individual stations and provided the network with mutual programs that could then be passed on, but in 1938, only 16 to 20% of the commercial programs on Lee radio stations originated with Mutual. Most of them were still produced by the Lees themselves. What the Lees really wanted was to have an independent regional network that could leverage the resources of a national network, and that worked for the Mutual Broadcasting System, which had a vision of national reach but local flavor. But unfortunately, that couldn't last. After the end of the war, the consolidation of stations and the growth of the Big Three would doom a small regional network. Tommy Lee had inherited a $9 million fortune from his father, consisting of the network and his father's car dealerships. He piloted his own plane. He sponsored race cars in Indianapolis. In 1936, he had a personal hot rod design, which he raced on empty lake beds in Southern California. Shortly before World War II, though, he was in a serious accident when he was T-boned by a truck at an intersection. He lived the rest of his life in considerable pain. In 1948, his mental health deteriorated, and the courts declared him mentally incompetent. 2 years later, the 44-year-old had a driver take him to the dentist in L.A. He went up 12 floors and jumped from the building, leaving his estate to an uncle. Don Lee's radio network and Mutual were sold in 1951 to General Teleradio, the broadcasting arms of the General Tire Company. While it maintained the Don Lee logo, the spirit of independence and innovation ended. After a long series of sales where the company lost its logo and its name, the constituent parts were sold to Westinghouse in 1996. Westinghouse owned CBS and merged the radio stations with CBS Radio. It took a long time getting there, but eventually CBS would get control over the Lee network after all. In 1948, W6XAO stopped being an experimental station and became a fully commercial station under the new call sign KTSL-TV, with the TSL standing for Thomas Lee. And even then, Lubke and the station continued to innovate. They built a huge antenna and dish that was dubbed the Mountain Shooter in order to broadcast the 1948 Tournament of Roses parade from Pasadena to Los Angeles. They built the antenna to offset the effects of a 200-foot mountain range, which blocked the transmission, in conjunction with a 9-foot diameter dish in Pasadena. But like the radio stations, the Lee television station wouldn't survive Tommy's death. It was acquired by CBS on January 1st, 1951, and the call letters were changed to KNXT to match the local CBS radio station, KNX. The same station CBS had bought to replace Lee's radio station in 1936. Today it exists as KCBS Los Angeles. CBS moved the station off of Mount Lee, and the transmitter that remains is now owned and operated by the City of Los Angeles. Harry Lubke died in 1991, almost completely unknown and largely unrecognized for his technical innovations and his part as a television pioneer. When he died, it was not noted prominently even in local newspapers, and it seems his technical writings and journals were thrown out. His legacy didn't end with his work at the Lee Network, however. He was president of the Television Academy and is credited with coining the name Emmy Award when he suggested IMMY, I-M-M-Y, a term for the Image Orthicon camera. He co-founded the Society of Television Engineers in 1940, and his later years became a patent lawyer. But for the one-time face of West Coast television broadcasting, few people remember his technical innovations. Today, Lubke and the Lees are largely forgotten. They're relegated to obscure trivia of early television history. Their independent streak, while laudable, just didn't have a place in the broadcasting world after the Second World War. And the sheer cultural weight and the omnipresence of the large networks and large developers like RCA simply overshadowed the technical contributions of a small experimental station that never had more than a few thousand viewers in the LA area. But their independent streak and their technical innovation was important. They took a small experimental station and turned it into a station of early television firsts. And Lubke's contribution to things like tube synchronization materially impacted the future of television. They also had that great commitment to original programming, which was really ahead of its time and presaged the time when families would gather together in the living room for prime time. The golden age of broadcast television simply would not have been the same were it not for the independent streak of the Lee Broadcasting Network. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.